Honda smashed every record with this little car, did a mic drop and basically left the game for 10 years. Once they were done with this chassis, they pretty much weren't seen again until 1985, the Honda N360. This little champion was Honda's first full-scale mass-produced passenger car and their first step to becoming a household name the world over. Sure, Honda had other achievements before the N360, like a lot. And despite what GT6 will tell you, they had other four-wheel vehicles besides the S-Series, arguably one of the best-looking K-trucks of all time, and it had Japan's first ever twin-cam engine in it, the T360. But yeah, the Japanese people were like, that don't impress me much, and agreed with GT6 that Honda was pretty much just a motorcycle company that dabbled in four-wheel sports cars. Talk about unappreciated. The N360's competition had all put the engine in the rear, but Honda started their design by following the 1959 Mini's layout and putting the engine in the front and making the car front-wheel drive. I need to go find a Mazda 360 and an N360 because I need to settle this. The N360 was reported to be the first four-seater K car that was actually comfortable to be in. Mazda also made this claim about the Mazda 360 Kzaral. Honda were able to maximize cabin space by minimizing engine space, and believe it or not, 2 golf bags fit in the back. Speaking of the back, the trunk lid was made of ABS plastic and the rear seats could easily be removed for even more golf bags. But the engine up front had its positives and negatives. On the plus side, making the car FF gave the car a lot more cabin space than the Subaru 360 and the Mazda 360 Kzaral. Having the engine up front added high-speed stability, and Honda thought that this was important because for most people this would be their first ever car, and they wanted it to be easy to drive. The engine up front also helped keep the engine cool, something their competitors kind of struggled with. They were also able to keep their emphasis on simplicity and use the waste heat from the air-cooled engine to heat the cabin. On the not-so-plus side, that's not the best way of heating a cabin because you are often blessed with a strong smell of oil and gasoline. Speaking of positives and negatives, as I said before, Honda wanted the emphasis to be on simplicity, but they also wanted performance. Hey, it worked for the Subaru 360, make it fast. With less soundproofing and a simplified structure, they got the weight down to somewhere between 475 to 520 kilos. So it landed right in between the Subaru 360 and the Mazda 360 Kzaral, but the noise and vibrations were described as intense. Initially, Honda offered red, white, and light blue, but I guess not being used to actually having much of a choice, 70% of those cars sold were white. Nevertheless, Honda was pushing for fashion, and aided by what seems to be at least 13 different color choices, and a rag-top version called the Sunroof, the people loved the N360, and it quickly became the best-selling car for 83 months in total. But more on that ragtop. It could slide the full length of the car and could be locked in any position along the rail. Epic. The N360 M-Type came with tint. Can you believe that? The game is claiming sales of 400,000 cars in just 2 years, beating the previous record set by the Subaru 360. The N360 was really loved by young people and earned a couple of nicknames: N-Koro and the not-so-popular N-Sun, or Mr. N. In fact, if you Google N-Koro, the N360 actually comes up. The nighttime streets of Tokyo were full of modified N360s blasting out the Beatles, but that could only just be heard over the noisy-ass engines. The N360 crowd were described as just like the scary street races of the 70s, but cuter and a lot slower. Other points of note are the gearbox, which was in the engine sump and made of straight cut gears, so it would have been virtually indestructible. The marketing for it was the same constant mesh as an F1 car. What they actually meant was, it's a motorbike gearbox. They put the steering shaft in the center of the car so it would be easy to produce left or right hand vehicles. Very clever. The N360's manual gear shifter was much further forward and up higher than the traditional manuals, giving a lot more leg room, but kept the joy of driving that comes from a traditional gear shifter. This same concept can be seen in the Citroën 2CV and in the 2001 to 2005 Honda Civic. Did you know that the N360 was the first K car to have curved glass on the sides? This allowed for thinner doors. In line with their safety slogan, the N360 came with crash padding around the place and and seatbelt anchors. The belts were a factory option, of course, but you get the anchors for free. Did you know that the N in N360 stands for Norimono, which with a brute force translate equals a thing you can ride? Honda wanted you to drive and they wanted you to enjoy it. So like the Subaru 360, this was tested on a toge. This time it was Usui, the home of Impact Blue from Initial D. During testing, the noise was described as unmistakably Honda. Soichiro Honda was a very interesting dude who loved the booze. He was once so inebriated at a party that he pushed a geisha out a third-story window. But as luck would have it, as she fell, she got tangled in the power lines. Rescuers had to cut power to the whole town to free her, and she was reportedly uninjured. Also, as luck would have it, Mr. Honda had enough money to make it all go away. In another incident involving geisha and alcohol, he had a couple of geisha in his car while he was DUI and crashed off a bridge. But again, no one was hurt and money made the problem go away. Soichiro Honda knew what he wanted, didn't care what it cost, and wasn't interested in cutting corners. Metaphorically. Before production began on the N360, Honda made a clay model. They made a mold of this model and were about to begin production when Soichiro Honda came in, I like to imagine completely shit-faced and carrying an alcoholic beverage, and was like, you know what, I don't like the look of the back of this thing. Literally threw his drink away, cross-body underarm style, grabbed hold of a hand plane, completely changed the shape of the model and said, here, go with this. Can you imagine the look on the other workers' faces when they saw the boss stroll in and just start ripping into a finished clay model, knowing full well that the expensive mold that they had just made was now scrap? I like to imagine two guys gently moving the mold from one place to another in the workshop before this started going down. Their jaws drop as they watch old mate with a hand plane, and upon hearing the here, go with this, they just threw the mold on the ground in disgust. From the beginning, Honda wanted a car that looked small but was roomy inside, was popular with the young folk, and above all, surprisingly powerful. Well, we've covered the first three, so let's get to the surprisingly powerful part. Originally, they wanted to put the T360 engine in it, but decided that the all-alloy 354cc air-cooled 4-stroke 2-cylinder based off the CB450 engine was a better choice. It was smaller and allowed for more cabin space, but even if that wasn't the case, Honda's distribution and service centers would be their pre-existing motorcycle shops, and the mechanics in there would be able to diagnose and repair an engine if it was very similar or the same to a motorcycle engine. The Subaru 360 put out 16 horsepower. The Mazda 360 Kzaral put out 18 horsepower. The Honda N360 put out a soul-rattling 31 horsepower at 8,500 RPM and started a horsepower arms race that would last for the next 20 years. Wait, that's almost double the horsepower of any other K car. Yep, it could go from 0 to 100 in 22 seconds. Need to test that. It could go from 0 to 100 in 22 seconds. In real life, takes 47 seconds in game. The reported top speed was 115 kilometers per hour, but I got a total of 130 in second gear under its own steam before the limiter kicked in. Let's do that again, but I'll shift to third. Watch what happens. Nothing. The engine doesn't have the power to push the car. Top speed downhill was 151 kilometers per hour in third. This car does not match reports of how the car actually drives. Honda definitely wouldn't have added a fourth gear if it was useless. Anyway, let's not flip tables, it's just for entertainment purposes. In a later model, they added dual carbs and that put out 36 horsepower. That brought the 0 to 100 time down to 21.5 seconds, and the max speed was raised by 5 kilometers per hour. So I'm really not sure what Polyphony Digital were doing here. Now that the Honda N360 has blown your mind, let's do that again. The N360 was selling for between 313,000 and 315,000 yen, while everything else was selling for between 350,000 to 450,000 yen. So not only was it more roomy, had more color choices, was not overly heavy, and was the most powerful K car ever, it was cheap. Some might say too cheap. Haters started calling it the poor man's Mini Cooper. So what happened to it? Well, it kind of evolved, and it also kind of died. Honda was always trying to make things better, and the N360 had two model changes, once in 1969 and again in 1970. And finally, they did a sportier spin-off before that name was retired. Coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally, in 1969, a group of people in Japan saw what was happening in the USA with the lemons problem and thought it would be a good way to make some cash. So they rallied together and tried to sue Honda and a bunch of other companies. They even convinced the family members of one guy that crashed his N360 N360 and died that the accident could be blamed on Honda. So they did. The N360's name was dragged through the mud, which could explain why Honda released the N2 in 1969, coincidentally at the same time this lawsuit started, and the N3 in 1970. Perhaps that was to try and regain any lost confidence in the car. The resulting legal battle that ensued cleared Honda, but you gotta admit that it would be hard to come back from something like that. Production of all versions of the N360 stopped in June of 1974, but Honda wasn't done. Oh no, they were just getting started, and so are we, because the next car we're gonna look at is also a Honda.